Hello. In this video, which will be the first video in the statistics section, we're going to go over some of the basic terminology that we'll be using throughout this class. This is just a little bit of what we're going to see. We're actually going to have multiple videos in terminology because there is a lot of terminology in statistics in order to understand what's going on. So to start off, we have the word statistics itself. The class is called statistics. The field that we are studying here is called statistics. It can be broken down into different types of statistics, which we will see later on. And it, in fact, also is going to mean something else right here. It's going to be a specific thing that we're going to study in this class. So the word statistics is pretty loaded. Let me start out with a definition here, a standard definition for statistics. Statistics is the science of collecting, organizing, summarizing, and analyzing information in order to draw conclusions or answer questions. In addition, statistics is about providing a measure of confidence in any conclusions. So I just want to start off this class by telling you that for a lot of things that we're going to be going through this semester, there isn't a perfectly correct right answer to the problem. That's quite different than a lot of other math classes where I ask you to solve for X, and guess what? There is a right answer and there are lots of wrong answers. In this class, a lot of the answers are up for interpretation, and that's because this class really lines up and overlaps with the real world, and in the real world, things don't work out perfectly. Think about you're trying to design some building. Now, it's not really a statistics problem, but just think about a real world problem like designing a building. Sure, you can go ahead and put on the computer, you can calculate how long each wall is going to be, how thick each wall needs to be, the material needed, etc., etc., etc. But then when the company comes in to build that building, things are not going to be exactly correct. The dimensions are not going to be perfectly exactly what you wrote down on your computer. The materials may end up using a little bit more than you expected. Maybe some had to go to waste because there was mistakes happen. Basically, things always go wrong. You never get perfect, correct answers to anything in any real problem, including statistics. And so you have to understand that we're going to do the best we can and we're going to make a conclusion based on that. But someone else could look at the data and look at it in a different fashion and maybe make a different conclusion. So what's going to end up happening, say when I give you an exam on this material, you and your classmate may have exactly opposite answers on a problem, but each of you, if you justify it well, you may still both get full credit on the problem. So a lot of this class is learning how to look at things and understand and interpret the data that's presented to you. And as I said, there isn't necessarily one correct way to do that, but we are going to be learning best practices on how we can try to look at these problems. Now, we can break it down further here. You see, we have collecting, organizing, summarizing, and analyzing information. So all of that is going out in the world, getting data in some fashion, and we're going to have multiple videos talking about how we might do that. Then taking that data, try to make it in some sort of organized fashion. And again, there are going to be multiple ways we might organize our data. Usually you're going to have a whole bunch of data and someone doesn't want to look at, thousands and thousands or millions or more numbers. That's not going to be very meaningful. So you need some way to summarize the data. And lastly, we'd also need some way to analyze information. What is this information really telling us? That's kind of the first part of the class. We're going to look at all of that there. And then when we're going to get to the last part of the class, that's where we're going to take all the stuff we've done already and we're going to use that data to draw conclusions or answer questions. This is the part where we go further, where we are no longer as confident because, before we took data, we have actual data. We're fairly confident in that data is actually, gathered well. But now we're going to try to use that to make some sort of prediction or gain information about something we don't have data for. Maybe we took a small group of people and we're trying to extrapolate to everyone. Or maybe we have data about the past and we want to extrapolate to the future. So that's going to be the second half of statistics here, which we'll actually get to near the end of the semester. And as I said, we need to be able to try to say how confident we may be in what we're doing. Because depending on the procedure you use and everything else, you may be more or less confident in the answer you give. And you'd like to have some way of measuring that. If your answer is not very confident, you would like to be able to get that across to whoever you are presenting this information to so that can help them in making their decisions. Continuing on here, the next terminology we want to talk about is population versus individual versus sample. This one's kind of easy to break down. So population, that is the entire group under consideration. And a lot of times when you hear population, you might hear of, say, the human population. But even when we say that, it may not be clear what we're talking about. Maybe it's the human population in the world. Maybe it's the human population in our country. Maybe it's the human population in our state or our city or our school. So population can be different for different people. It's just whatever the entire group it is that you're studying, that's what you're going to call your population. And you want to be clear when you are presenting data what your population was. So that if the data you gave represents a certain population, someone would not want to mistake that data to apply to a different population. So if you say, I want to restrict to just the students at our school, then someone would not want to necessarily use that data to apply to a different school that has a different population. The next one here is individual, which you could probably guess. That is a single object or person in the group, in the population. So again, if the population is all of the students at our school, then you, as an individual student in the school, you would be an individual in statistics. Now, a lot of times we are going to be talking about where our individuals are humans, but it doesn't have to be. You could be, for example, doing a study where you are going to weigh oranges at a supermarket, in which case a single orange would be the individual in your study. And the population might be all the oranges in the supermarket, or all the oranges in California, or all the oranges in the world. This is your population depending on what you want to study there. Individual is just a single one. Now here's the part that we're going to be using over and over and over again. A sample is a small group, and maybe I should put small in quotations because it's small relative to the size of the population, but you can still have samples that are very large. So a small group chosen from the population. And just as in many other things we've been talking about, there are lots of ways in which you could choose that sample, choose which individuals to take. And we will study a few different ways of doing that and some pros and cons of each of them. But for right now, we really just want to talk about what the word sample means. I do want to point out something. As we go throughout this class, we are going to be dealing with data in many different fashions, and almost always it is going to be sample data. That is because it is very, very difficult to get data from the entire population of whatever it is you're talking about. If that population is thousands of individuals or millions of individuals or billions of individuals, it becomes crazy difficult to try to get data from all of that. And so almost all problems, almost all applications of statistics, you are talking about sample data. That's just how it's going to be. And one of the chief goals, as I was saying earlier, is we want to take our sample information and somehow draw conclusions about the whole population. And you might want to stop me already and say, well, wait a second, how can I take a sample of 1,000 people and say that applies to everyone in California? That's crazy. And you might be right? Maybe that sample we chose is not very representative of people in California. But one of the things we're going to do in this class is we're going to learn about how could we pick these people to have them be better representative of everyone in the population, and how can we then say how close to the real population values we get are. That's all stuff we're going to study. So right now, I totally understand why you might be suspicious that we are going to take a sample and extrapolate to the population, but we are going to talk about that in a lot more detail. Now the next two terms here, parameter and statistic, this is kind of just a quick definition here. So I'll say it and then I'll talk about it. So a parameter, this is a numerical summary of a population, whereas a statistic is a numerical summary of a sample. So let's say we want to talk about, I don't know, the average height of adult males in the United States. If I could take the data of every adult male in the US, the whole population of them, and I calculate the average height of them, which is a way of summarizing all those numbers, a numerical summary, then the answer we get would be called a parameter because it's based off of the population. Parameter, population, parameter, population. On the other hand, if I were to take data from a sample, let's say I pick 100 random adult men from the US, and I calculated the average height of my sample, that's no longer a population value, it's a sample value. We give it a different name, we call it statistic. So the statistic is the name of the whole field, right? Statistics we're here, but we're also going to study the statistics here as in a specific summary of sample data. And you can imagine, as I already talked about, we are very rarely going to have values for parameters. Because again, in order to have a value for a parameter, you need to have all population data, and that's very difficult. So again, almost everything we are going to do in this class for calculations and getting values, they are going to be statistics, not parameters. But we are going to take the statistic and hope that it is close in value to the parameter. So those 100 men that I picked randomly, hopefully their average height is close to the population average height. And again, going back, that means we want to try to say how confident we are in our answer. So we will talk about that later. Now there's something I want to kind of point out here that may cause some trouble as we go through this, but it's kind of just something you have to get over it. And it's not my choice, it is just standard statistics, is that when we have parameters here, we are usually going to use Greek letters. And we will talk in detail for each parameter. We talk about what letter we are using, but just understand that when you see a weird symbol, it's almost certainly going to be a Greek letter. Sorry, it's almost certainly going to be a parameter because it is a Greek letter. So that's just how it's done. Again, I didn't choose that. That's just the way it's done in statistics, but I thought I would point it out right now so you can keep an eye as you're reading through the material that the weird letters are almost certainly talking about parameters. Now the last thing I've already touched on here, descriptive versus inferential statistics. So for descriptive, this is where you're just taking in data and talking about it. If I go back up here at the beginning, that would be the collecting, organizing, summarizing and analyzing data. Oops, I can spell. Analyzing data. So that's what we call descriptive statistics. That's the beginning of our course, the first third of it. Then the last third is going to be the part that is the inferential statistics, and that is where we are going to draw conclusions or answer questions. So again, we go out, we collect data in whatever fashion we talk about, we get these numbers here. We're pretty confident that those are the actual numbers. There are some things that can happen that might mean our data is bad, and that's a topic for a different video. But generally, if we have actual data, we're pretty confident that this is the actual data that we got in our sample. And so we just want to describe it. So descriptive is kind of like, just take what's actually there, what you really have, and talk about it. Inferential, that's where we say, okay, let's take what we have already that we're pretty confident about, and let's move beyond that. Let's go to something that we don't know and try to figure out. And as I said earlier, that might be take something from a sample and use that to try to make a conclusion about the whole population. Now there's a jump there, and things can go wrong. What if my sample was not very good, not very representative of the population? Then making that jump from the sample data to making a guess about the population would not work out so well. On the other hand, what if I have data from something going on in the past, and I now want to try to predict the future? That would also be inferential statistics. And again, there's that jump there. There's no guarantee that what happens in the future is going to follow the same pattern as the past. So inferential is the one where, as I said, you and your neighbor may have different conclusions based on the same information and both be considered correct, because you are trying to make this jump and you have to decide, well, am I confident enough